Spring 1945. The cobblestone streets of Colmar, France echoed with the rumble of American tanks as the 3rd Infantry Division pushed deeper into the Alsace region. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Boston had seen enough of war to know that liberation didn't always look like the movies. Sometimes it was messier, more complicated, and required decisions that no training manual could prepare you for. The medieval town bore the scars of occupation. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets, their glass long since shattered by artillery. Bullet holes pocked the ancient stone walls like a deadly constellation, and the smell of cordite still hung heavy in the morning mist. Broken roof tiles littered the streets, and hastily painted Nazi propaganda still clung to some walls, though most had been torn down or painted over in the first flush of liberation. O'Brien's squad moved cautiously through the narrow streets, their boots crunching on debris as they conducted their sweep for remaining German forces. They had liberated this town 3 days ago, but the real work was just beginning. Liberation meant more than driving out the enemy. It meant restoring order, providing medical care, establishing communication lines, distributing food supplies, and often mediating between civilians who had spent 4 years under Nazi rule, where neighbor had been turned against neighbor, where survival sometimes meant making impossible choices that would haunt people for the rest of their lives. The 3rd Infantry Division had fought its way across Europe, from the beaches of Anzio through the mountains of Italy, across the fields of France, and now into the heart of Alsace-Lorraine. They had seen the worst of humanity in the concentration camps they had liberated, the mass graves they had uncovered, the broken survivors they had found cowering in cellars and forests. But they had also seen the best, the ordinary people who had risked everything to help strangers, to preserve some fragment of decency in a world gone mad. As they rounded the corner into the main square, O'Brien stopped dead in his tracks. His men behind him cursed under their breath, their weapons instinctively rising before they realized there was no immediate threat. There, chained to the old iron lamppost in the center of the square, was a young woman. Her head had been completely shaved, her clothes were torn and stained with blood and worse things, and dried blood crusted around cuts on her face and arms. A crude cardboard sign hung around her neck with the word "Collaboratrice" scrawled in black paint, the letters dripping like accusations. The square was empty now, but the evidence of a crowd's recent presence was everywhere. Broken bottles glinted in the morning sun. Stones lay scattered across the cobblestones. Rotting vegetables and human waste created a nauseating stench around the lamppost. Someone had built a small fire nearby, and the ashes were still warm. The woman looked up as they approached, her eyes hollow but defiant. She couldn't have been more than 25, but her face carried the weight of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, lost too much. O'Brien had encountered this before. In the chaos following liberation, accusations of collaboration flew like shrapnel from an exploding shell. Women were particularly vulnerable to these mob justice rituals. Their heads were shaved in the ancient ritual of shame. They were paraded through streets like medieval criminals, beaten, spat upon, sometimes killed. Often the accusations were based on nothing more than rumor, jealousy, or settling old scores that had nothing to do with the war. A woman who had received food from a German soldier to feed her starving children, a shopkeeper who had been forced to serve German customers, a nurse who had treated wounded German soldiers alongside French civilians, all could find themselves branded as collaborators. He approached slowly, his rifle lowered but ready. The woman watched him with a mixture of fear and hope, as if she couldn't quite believe that rescue might be possible. When he was close enough to see the full extent of her injuries, he felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't just rough justice. This was torture. "Please," she said, in heavily accented English, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am not what they say." O'Brien knelt beside her, examining the heavy chains that bound her to the lamppost. They were industrial chains, the kind used in factories or shipyards, secured with a massive padlock that would have required bolt cutters or a sledgehammer to break. Someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure she couldn't escape. The chains had rubbed her wrists and ankles raw, and he could see infection beginning to set in around the wounds. "What's your name?" he asked gently, his voice carrying the authority of command but also the compassion he had learned from dealing with countless refugees and survivors. "Marie Dubois," she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming or crying or both. "I live here. I have always lived here. Who did this to you, Marie?" Tears began to flow down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the dirt and dried blood that covered her face. The people of the town, my neighbors, people I have known since childhood, they think I betrayed the resistance. They think I gave information to the Germans. O'Brien felt his jaw tighten. He had seen what real collaboration looked like. He had interrogated French civilians who had actively worked with the Gestapo, who had turned in their neighbors for money or favor, who had helped the Germans hunt down resistance fighters and Jews. But he had also seen what happened when fear and anger overcame reason, when communities turned on themselves in an orgy of recrimination and revenge. "Tell me what really happened," he said, settling down beside her to show that he had time to listen, that her story mattered. Marie took a shuddering breath, gathering strength from somewhere deep inside. "I was part of the resistance. I worked as a courier, carrying messages between cells. For 2 years I carried secrets across this region through German checkpoints past Gestapo patrols. 3 weeks ago they caught me. The Gestapo. They took me to their headquarters in Strasbourg." She paused, her body trembling with the memory. O'Brien waited patiently. He had learned that rushing trauma victims only made them shut down, made them retreat back into the protective shell of silence. "They tortured me for information. They wanted names, locations, plans. They used electricity, they used water, they used things I cannot speak of. But I told them nothing. Nothing." Her voice grew stronger with each word, as if the act of speaking the truth was giving her back some measure of her stolen dignity. "When you Americans liberated Strasbourg, I was freed from their prison. I came home to Colmar thinking I was safe, thinking the nightmare was over. But someone had spread rumors that I had talked, that I had betrayed my comrades to save myself. The mob formed yesterday morning. They dragged me from my apartment, from my bed where I was still recovering from what the Germans had done to me." O'Brien studied her face as she spoke. He had interrogated enough prisoners and witnesses during his time in Europe to recognize truth when he heard it. There was something in her eyes, a clarity that came from having endured the worst and survived with integrity and tact. But more than that, there was a strength that impressed him, a refusal to be broken even by this ultimate betrayal. He turned to his squad, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a non-commissioned officer who had earned his stripes in combat. "Johnson, get the bolt cutters from the truck. Martinez, radio for a medic and tell them we need someone who speaks French. Thompson, I want you to find the mayor or whoever's in charge of this town, and somebody find me a blanket and some water." As his men scattered to follow orders, O'Brien stayed with Marie. The morning sun was growing stronger and he could see that she was dehydrated and exhausted. "Can you prove you were with the resistance?" "There is a man, Jacques Lefebvre. He was my contact, my handler. If he is still alive, he can tell you the truth. He knows everything I did, every mission I carried out. Where can we find him?" "He had a safe house on Rue de la République, above the bakery. But I do not know if he survived the liberation. There was fighting in that part of town." Private Johnson returned with the bolt cutters, a heavy tool designed for cutting through wire obstacles and enemy fortifications. Within minutes, the chains fell away from Marie's wrists and ankles with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo through the empty square. She collapsed forward, and O'Brien caught her, feeling how light she was, how the weeks of imprisonment and torture had wasted her body down to skin and bones. The medic arrived, a young corpsman named Davis, who had seen more trauma in the past year than most doctors saw in a lifetime. He began treating her wounds with the efficient competence of someone who had learned his trade in field hospitals and aid stations. As he worked, cleaning and bandaging the worst of the cuts and abrasions, he kept up a steady stream of gentle conversation in broken French, trying to keep Marie conscious and responsive. O'Brien established a temporary command post in the town hall, a medieval building that had somehow survived both the German occupation and the recent fighting. This wasn't just about one woman, he realized. This was about the kind of society they were trying to rebuild in liberated Europe. If they allowed mob justice to prevail, if they let fear and suspicion poison the peace they had fought so hard to win, then what had they really accomplished? The American approach to liberation was fundamentally different from what the Nazis had practiced during their years of occupation, where the Germans had ruled through terror and brutality, systematically destroying the social fabric of the communities they controlled. The Americans sought to restore justice and dignity. O'Brien had seen this philosophy in action across Europe. In Italy, American forces had protected civilians from vengeful partisans seeking to settle old scores. In France, they had intervened to prevent summary executions of suspected collaborators. It wasn't always popular with the locals, who often wanted immediate and violent revenge, but it was right. The U.S. Army had developed detailed protocols for dealing with liberated territories, procedures that emphasized due process and the rule of law. They had learned from the chaos that followed the First World War, when the absence of proper legal frameworks had allowed extremism to flourish. This time they were determined to do better, to help build societies that could sustain peace and democracy. Within an hour, Thompson returned with a group of townspeople, including the mayor, a nervous man in his 60s who kept wringing his hands and avoiding eye contact. Behind him came a crowd of perhaps 50 villagers, their faces a mixture of defiance and growing uncertainty. Word had spread quickly through the small town that the Americans were investigating what had happened in the square. O'Brien had set up in the main hall of the town building, with Marie seated beside him, now cleaned and bandaged by the medic. She wore an American field jacket that dwarfed her small frame, and someone had found her a cup of hot coffee and a K-ration, which she ate slowly and carefully. The simple act of eating seemed to restore some of her strength and dignity. "I want to understand what happened here," O'Brien began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, but also the measured tone of someone seeking truth rather than vengeance. "This woman was chained to a lamppost and beaten. I want to know why." The mayor stepped forward, his hands still wringing nervously. "Sergeant, you must understand our situation. We have suffered under the Germans for 4 years. We have seen neighbors disappear in the night, never to return. We have watched our young men shipped away to labor camps in Germany. We have seen our food taken, our homes searched, our dignity stripped away piece by piece. When we heard that Marie had been captured and then released, when we heard rumors that she had given information to save herself, we were angry. We were hurt. We felt betrayed." "What evidence did you have of this collaboration?" O'Brien asked, his tone remaining neutral, but his eyes sharp. The mayor's eyes shifted away and he began to stammer. "Well, there were stories, people said things." "What kind of stories? Be specific." An older woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice shrill with remembered anger. She was seen talking to German officers. She was seen going into their headquarters willingly without guards. She came back when others didn't. "How do you explain that?" Marie's voice was steady when she responded, though O'Brien could see the effort it cost her. "Yes, I was seen going into their headquarters, because I was their prisoner. They dragged me there in chains just as you chained me to that lamppost. The difference is that they were my enemies. You were supposed to be my friends." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, and O'Brien could see doubt beginning to creep into their expressions. He held up a hand to quiet the murmurs from the crowd. "Did anyone actually witness her giving information to the Germans?" Silence. "Did anyone see her leading German forces to resistance hideouts?" More silence. "Did anyone see her accepting money or favors from the occupying forces?" The silence stretched longer this time, becoming uncomfortable. "So you chained a woman to a lamppost and beat her based on rumors and suspicion? Based on the fact that she survived when others didn't?" The crowd began to look uncomfortable. A few people in the back started to slip away, unwilling to face the implications of what they had done, but others remained, their faces showing the first signs of shame and doubt. At that moment, Thompson returned with another man, elderly, but with the bearing of someone who had seen action. His clothes were worn but clean, and his eyes were sharp and intelligent. Despite his age, he moved with the careful alertness of someone who had spent years living in danger. "This is Jacques Lefebvre," Thompson announced. "We found him at the bakery, just like she said." Marie's face lit up for the first time since they had found her, a transformation so complete that she looked like a different person entirely. "Jacques, you are alive. I was so afraid they had killed you." The old man rushed to her side, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that spoke of deep affection and respect. "Marie, my dear child, when I heard what they had done to you, I came as quickly as I could. I have been hiding since the liberation, afraid that the same madness that took you might take me as well." O'Brien gestured for Jacques to take a seat. "Mr. Lefebvre, I understand you worked with Marie in the resistance. She was one of our best couriers," Jacques said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect in the underground. For 2 years she carried messages between our cell and others throughout Alsace and Lorraine. She risked her life dozens of times, walking past German checkpoints with coded messages sewn into her clothing, carrying intelligence that helped save countless lives. When the Gestapo caught her, we feared the worst. We expected our entire network to be rolled up within days. How can you be certain she didn't talk? Because our network remained intact. If she had talked, if she had given them even one name or one location, we would all be dead or in camps. Instead, we continued our operations right up until liberation. We sabotaged 3 more German supply convoys, helped 6 Allied airmen escape to Switzerland, and provided intelligence that helped your forces plan their assault on this region. The crowd was now completely silent. The mayor looked as if he wanted to disappear into the floor. Several people were openly weeping, the full weight of their actions beginning to sink in. Jacques continued, his voice growing stronger and more passionate. Marie was captured because she volunteered for a dangerous mission. We needed someone to carry plans for sabotaging a German ammunition depot outside Strasbourg. It was a suicide mission, we all knew it. The Germans had increased their patrols, their security was tighter than ever, but she insisted on going. She said that if the mission succeeded, it might shorten the war by weeks, might save hundreds of lives. The Gestapo had set a trap, but she walked into it willingly, because she believed in our cause, because she was willing to die for France. The old resistance fighter's testimony carried weight that no amount of American authority could match. This was a Frenchman vouching for another Frenchman, a neighbor speaking for a neighbor, a comrade defending a comrade. The crowd's hostility began to crumble as the truth became undeniable. She endured 3 weeks of torture, Jacques continued, his voice breaking slightly. 3 weeks of the worst things human beings can do to each other. And she never broke. Not once. When the Americans liberated Strasbourg and freed the prisoners, she was barely alive. But she was alive, and she had told them nothing. O'Brien looked at the crowd, seeing the shame and horror beginning to replace the anger and suspicion. It seems you owe this woman more than an apology. The mayor stepped forward, his face red with shame and his voice barely above a whisper. Marie, we are sorry. We let fear cloud our judgment. We should have investigated before we acted. We should have trusted you. But O'Brien wasn't finished. He stood up, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall with the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about justice and courage. An apology isn't enough. You nearly killed an innocent woman. You became the very thing you claimed to have been fighting against. You became a mob that punished without evidence, that condemned without trial, that chose vengeance over justice. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. I've seen what real collaboration looks like. I've interrogated French civilians who sold out their neighbors for a few francs or a little extra food. I've seen what happens when people choose their own safety over their principles, when they decide that survival is more important than honor. But I've also seen what happens when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things, to risk everything for what they believe is right. Marie Dubois is a hero. She deserves your respect, not your chains. The sergeant's words echoed through the hall, and for a moment, the weight of what had happened settled on everyone present. This wasn't just about one woman or one town. This was about the kind of society they wanted to build from the ashes of war, about whether they would choose to be guided by fear or by justice, by suspicion or by truth. The crowd began to disperse, many people unable to meet Marie's eyes as they left. But some remained, including a young woman who approached hesitantly, tears streaming down her face. Marie, I am sorry. I was there yesterday. I threw stones at you. I called you terrible names. I was wrong, and I will carry the shame of what I did for the rest of my life. One by one, others came forward. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to show that shame could lead to redemption, that communities could heal from their mistakes, that people could choose to be better than their worst moments. As the hall emptied, O'Brien sat with Marie and Jacques. The old resistance fighter was explaining what had happened to their network during the final weeks of the war, who had survived, who had been lost, who had been captured in the last desperate German sweeps. The stories he told painted a picture of ordinary people who had made extraordinary choices under impossible circumstances. What will you do now? O'Brien asked Marie, genuinely curious about how someone could rebuild a life after such betrayal. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands wrapped around the coffee cup, gathering her thoughts. I want to help rebuild, not just the buildings, but the trust. What happened to me could happen to others. People are afraid. They are angry. They want someone to blame for all the suffering they have endured. But we cannot build a free society on suspicion and revenge. We cannot let fear make us into the very monsters we fought against. O'Brien nodded, impressed by her wisdom and strength. This was why they had fought. Not just to defeat the Germans, but to preserve the idea that justice required evidence, that democracy required tolerance, that freedom required the courage to protect even those you disagreed with or distrusted. The conversation reminded him of stories he had heard from other theaters of war, stories that illustrated the stark difference between American and Nazi approaches to dealing with enemies and prisoners. American forces had liberated dozens of concentration camps, had found thousands of prisoners in conditions that defied imagination. They had seen the ultimate result of a society that abandoned justice for expedience, that chose fear over courage, that decided that some people were less human than others. But they had also seen something else entirely, something that gave him hope for the future. Back in the United States, German prisoners of war were being treated with a dignity that amazed their captives. In Texas, captured German soldiers worked on ranches and farms, were paid wages for their labor, allowed to write letters to their families, even learned English in camp schools. They were fed better than many American civilians, housed in clean barracks and treated with respect. This wasn't sentimentality or weakness. It was strategy of the highest order. America was demonstrating that its strength came not from brutality, but from moral confidence. They could afford to treat their enemies well because they knew they were going to win, not just the war, but the peace that followed. They were showing the world that democracy wasn't just a political system, but a way of life, a set of values that guided behavior even toward those who had tried to destroy them. Over the following days, O'Brien's unit remained in Colmar as part of the occupation force. He watched with fascination as Marie began working with the local authorities to establish proper procedures for investigating collaboration claims. She helped set up a system where accusations had to be supported by evidence, where the accused had the right to defend themselves, where punishment fit the crime and was administered by proper legal authorities rather than angry mobs. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about the aftermath of war ever was. There were still people who refused to accept the truth about Marie, who muttered that the Americans were naive, that they didn't understand the complexities of life under occupation. But it was a start, a foundation upon which something better could be built. Jacques introduced O'Brien to other resistance members, and their stories painted a picture of a network that had been far more extensive and effective than the Germans had ever realized. Teachers who had hidden Jewish children in their classrooms, farmers who had sheltered downed Allied airmen in their barns, shopkeepers who had passed along intelligence hidden in bread loaves and milk bottles. They had risked everything not for glory or recognition, but because they believed in something larger than themselves. One evening, as O'Brien was preparing reports in his temporary office, Marie knocked on his door. She looked healthier now, her wounds healing, her hair beginning to grow back in a soft fuzz that caught the lamplight. More importantly, there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a sense of purpose that seemed to give her strength. "I wanted to thank you," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Not just for saving my life, but for showing our people what justice looks like. You could have simply cut me loose and moved on. Instead, you took the time to find the truth. You saved yourself," O'Brien replied, setting down his pen and giving her his full attention. "You could have given up, could have told the Gestapo what they wanted to hear. You could have broken under torture, and no one would have blamed you. But you didn't. I had good teachers. The resistance taught me that some things are worth suffering for, that there are principles more important than personal survival." O'Brien thought about the complexity of what they were trying to accomplish in liberated Europe. It wasn't enough to defeat the enemy militarily. They had to rebuild entire societies, restore faith in justice and democracy, and help people remember what it meant to live in freedom. They had to show that the values they had fought for were real, that they could work in practice as well as in theory. "Marie," he said, "what you went through, what you survived, it matters. Not just because you're alive, but because of what you represent. You're proof that people can choose to do the right thing even when it costs them everything. You're proof that the human spirit can survive even the worst that evil can inflict." She smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face completely. My father used to say that character is what you do when no one is watching. But I think he was wrong. Character is what you do when everyone is watching, when the whole world is judging you, when the easy choice is right there in front of you, and you choose the hard one instead. The next few days brought a steady stream of visitors to the town hall. Word had spread throughout the region about what had happened, and people came to hear Marie's story firsthand. Some came to apologize, others to learn, and a few to challenge her account. But Jacques was always there to corroborate her story, and gradually the truth became accepted not just in Colmar, but in the surrounding communities as well. O'Brien observed this process with fascination. He was watching democracy in action, messy and imperfect, but ultimately self-correcting. People were learning to question their assumptions, to demand evidence before making accusations, to think before they acted. It was exactly what America hoped to export to the world. The idea that truth and justice were worth pursuing, even when they were difficult and uncomfortable. A week later, O'Brien's unit received orders to move east toward Germany. The war was entering its final phase, and they were needed for the push into the German heartland. As they prepared to leave Colmar, he stopped by the town square one last time. The lamppost still stood there, but someone had cleaned away all the debris. Someone had planted flowers around its base, bright yellow daffodils that seemed to glow in the morning sunlight. Marie was there, along with Jacques and several other townspeople. They were hanging a small plaque on the lamppost, a simple brass plate that would weather the years ahead. O'Brien couldn't read the French inscription, but Marie translated for him. It says, "In memory of all who suffered for freedom, may we never forget the cost of justice or the price of abandoning it." The plaque was simple, but its message was profound. This community had learned something important about itself, about the difference between justice and vengeance, about the responsibility that came with freedom. They had learned that democracy wasn't just about voting or holding elections, but about how people treated each other, especially those they disagreed with or distrusted. As O'Brien's convoy rolled out of Colmar, he looked back to see Marie waving from the square. She had survived the Gestapo's torture, had endured her own people's betrayal, and had emerged with her humanity intact. She was building something new from the ruins of the old, something based on truth rather than fear, on justice rather than vengeance. The trucks rumbled through the countryside, past fields that would soon be green with spring crops, past villages that were slowly coming back to life. The war was almost over, but the real work was just beginning. They had to help build a world where what happened to Marie could never happen again, where people would choose courage over fear, truth over convenience, justice over revenge. Months later, as the war in Europe finally ended with Germany's unconditional surrender, O'Brien would receive a letter from Marie. She had been elected to the town council and was working to establish a school where children would learn not just reading and mathematics, but the principles of democracy and justice. She was teaching them that freedom wasn't just the absence of oppression, but the presence of responsibility, the willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. The letter ended with words that O'Brien would remember for the rest of his life. "You showed us that liberation is not something that happens to a people. It is something a people must choose every day, in every decision, in every moment when they must choose between what is easy and what is right. Thank you for reminding us that we are capable of being better than our worst impulses, that we can choose to be the people we want to be, rather than the people our fears make us." In the end, that was what the war had been about. Not just defeating an enemy, but proving that there was a better way to live, a better way to treat one another, a better way to build a society. It was about showing that democracy wasn't just a political system, but a moral choice, a commitment to treating all people with dignity and respect. And sometimes, that choice had to be made one person at a time, one act of courage at a time, one moment of compassion at a time. The woman chained to the lamppost had become a symbol of something larger than herself. She had shown that even in the darkest moments, even when everything seemed lost, people could choose to be better than their circumstances. They could choose justice over vengeance, truth over convenience, courage over fear. They could choose to light a lamp that would guide others out of the darkness, to build something beautiful from the ruins of something terrible. And in making that choice, they could prove that the sacrifices of war had not been in vain. that the price paid in blood and suffering had purchased something precious and lasting, the possibility of a world where justice and mercy could coexist, where enemies could become friends, where the human spirit could triumph over the forces that sought to destroy it. The lamppost in Colmar Square still stands today, a reminder that freedom is not a gift, but a responsibility, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. If you found this incredible story of courage and redemption as moving as we did, please consider subscribing to our channel for more untold stories from history. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these important tales to light and ensures you never miss our latest content. If you're already part of our community, we'd be grateful if you could give this video a thumbs up. Your likes help us reach more people who appreciate these powerful historical narratives. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you heard similar stories of courage during wartime? Do you know of other instances where ordinary people made extraordinary choices? Share your insights, and let's continue this important conversation about the lessons history teaches us. Your engagement through subscriptions, likes, and comments not only supports our work, but helps preserve these vital stories for future generations. Thank you for being part of our mission to keep history alive and meaningful.